Consider the terrifying possibility that the most private space you occupy, the silent theater of your own mind, is not actually empty. Tonight, as you lay in the dark, a thought will arrive. It might be a sudden worry about tomorrow, a sharp self-criticism, or a passing memory from a childhood summer. You will recognize the tone of this voice. It is the same familiar narrator that has accompanied you through every failure, every victory, and every mundane moment of your existence. You call this voice me. But if you sit completely still and observe the arrival of that next sentence, a chilling question inevitably surfaces. Who is actually speaking? And more importantly, who is the one listening? If you can hear the thought, you cannot be the thought. You are the audience. And if you are the audience, then the voice on the stage of your consciousness may be an echo of a mind that was never yours to begin with. We spend our entire lives operating under a grand, unexamined assumption that because a thought occurs inside our skull, we must have authored it. We treat our minds as private factories, generating original consciousness. Yet modern neuroscience and ancient metaphysics both converge on a far more haunting reality. The human brain does not create thought any more than a television set creates the broadcast it displays. It is an antenna. It is a biological receiver tuning into a vast, unseen spectrum of pre-existing frequencies, cultural architectures, and ancestral echoes. From the moment you drew your first breath, your mind was flooded with a language you did not invent, values you did not choose, and anxieties that were engineered long before your grandparents were born. You were born into a pre-existing symphony of noise, and over time, you simply mistook the background static for your own identity. When we begin to look closely at the anatomy of our internal monologue, the illusion of ownership starts to fracture. Think of the sudden, intrusive impulses that flash across your awareness, the inexplicable urge to look behind you, the random wave of dread that hits you in a crowded room, or the violent flash of anger that seems entirely disproportionate to the moment. We usually brush these aside as psychological anomalies or glitches in our chemistry. But what if these are not glitches at all? What if they are bleed-through events? Just as an old radio might pick up the faint, distorted signal of a distant station, on a stormy night, our brains constantly pick up the mental residue of the environment around us. We are swimming in an ocean of unspoken thoughts, collective traumas, and invisible architectures of control. Yet we proudly walk around believing that every ripple in our pond was caused by our own stone. This realization forces us into a profound psychological conflict. If the voice in your head is an echo of an external mind, then who are you when you stop thinking? The modern world terrified of silence, because silence is the exact condition under which the receiver stops functioning. When the static clears, the terrifying truth is revealed. The entity you spent decades defending, feeding, and calling by your name is largely a composite sketch drawn by others. It is a mosaic of parental expectations, societal programming, and evolutionary survival mechanisms designed to keep you predictable. You have been running a software program designed by a stranger, believing all along that you were the one writing the code. To understand how deep this architecture goes, we must examine the very nature of language itself. We do not think in a vacuum, we think in words. But language is an inherited technology. Every word you use to define your deepest desires or your most secret fears carries the historical weight, biases, and limitations of the millions of people who used it before you. When you use the word success, or failure, or even love, you are not expressing a pure, unadulterated truth from your soul. You are invoking a collective agreement. You are wearing a hand-me-down straitjacket of concepts. The very tools you use to understand your freedom are the chains that bind you to a shared, unoriginal reality. This brings us to an unsettling crossroad in human awareness. If our thoughts are fundamentally borrowed, then our perception of choice, free will, and individuality must be radically re-evaluated. We pride ourselves on our independent decisions, yet advertising executives, political strategists, and algorithms have known for decades that the human mind is a highly porous sponge. They do not need to force you to do anything. They only need to whisper a suggestion softly enough that it bypasses your defenses, allowing it to echo in the cavern of your mind until you mistake it for your own voice. You walk into a store or vote in an election, genuinely believing you made a conscious choice, completely blind to the fact that the seed of that choice was planted in your fertile subconscious weeks prior. But the mystery goes even deeper than simple social conditioning or modern algorithms. If we look at the oldest spiritual traditions of the world, they speak of an energetic architecture that transcends the physical plane. They warn of thought forms, egregores, and ancestral currents that look for open channels to manifest reality. When you fall into a state of deep, unexamined anger or despair, you are not just experiencing a personal emotion. You are tuning into a well-established reservoir of that specific energy. You become a temporary vessel for a momentum that existed long before your biological birth. You are literally being lived by the past. If we accept that the mind is a receiver, we must ask the ultimate question. What happens when we change the dial? What lies beyond the inherited noise of the collective ego? If the voice inside your head is merely an echo of a mind that was never yours, what is the nature of the silent witness that has been listening to it all this time? To chart a path through this labyrinth, we must first dismantle the classical mirror of Western psychology, which has long insisted that the ego is the absolute monarch of the skull. For centuries, we have been conditioned by the Cartesian decree. I think, therefore I am. This single philosophical turn tethered human existence directly to the movement of the intellect. It taught us that the churning of the mind is proof of the self, but if we subject this premise to a closer, more rigorous observation, the logic begins to dissolve. If you were truly the author of your thoughts, you would be able to predict your next thought 5 seconds before it arrives. You would be able to choose to think absolutely nothing for the next 3 hours without struggle. Yet, if you attempt to force the mind into total stillness, you will quickly find that you are not a dictator commanding an army. You are a captive locked in a room with a manic, hyperactive stranger who refuses to stop talking. This reveals a fundamental paradox of human consciousness. The mind operates independently of your will. Thoughts do not wait for your permission to emerge. They appear in your awareness fully formed, rising from a dark, inaccessible abyss beneath your conscious notice. Neurological studies have repeatedly shown that the brain's motor cortex registers a decision to move a limb up to several hundred milliseconds before the individual consciously experiences the choice to move it. The decision is made in the dark, and the conscious mind merely invents a story after the fact to claim responsibility for it. If the physical brain is preparing actions before you are aware of them, then the conscious voice claiming ownership of those actions is nothing more than a public relations department. It is a narrator arriving late to the scene, reading a script it did not write, and confidently declaring, "Look what I just came up with." If the individual mind is not the creator, then we must look to the medium through which these mental currents travel. Consider the air around you in this very room. It appears empty, silent, and completely devoid of information. Yet, if you were to place a radio receiver on your desk and turn the dial, that silence would instantly fracture into dozens of distinct voices, songs, and broadcasts. The room is not empty, it is dense with invisible electromagnetic data. The information is everywhere, passing through your walls, your flesh, and your bones at this exact moment. You only perceive it when a physical device translates those unseen waves into audible sound. The human nervous system functions in precisely the same manner. The brain is a biological transducer, a delicate instrument tuned to a highly specific bandwidth of reality. We do not experience the world as it actually is. We experience only the tiny fraction of data that our sensory apparatus is capable of translating. When we shift our perspective from the physical brain to the metaphysical field, we begin to realize that thoughts may exist as independent, energetic structures within the environment itself. They are not ephemeral, ghostly events confined to the interior of your cells. They are non-local phenomena floating through a shared mental ecosystem. When your personal frequency drops due to exhaustion, fear, or trauma, your biological antenna naturally drops its dial, tuning directly into the heavy ambient static of the collective anxieties surrounding you. You do not generate the depression. You inherit the station. This non-local nature of thought becomes terrifyingly apparent when we look at the phenomenon of mass hysteria, cultural polarization, and the rapid spread of ideological contagions. History is littered with moments where thousands of individuals suddenly, simultaneously, began acting out the exact same bizarre behaviors, from the dancing plagues of the Middle Ages to the sudden, explosive shifts in public hysteria that characterize the digital era. We like to believe these are simply instances of social imitation or peer pressure, but a deeper look suggests something far more sinister. These are moments where an entire population's antennas are forcibly locked onto a single external frequency, a powerful collective thought form, what the ancients called a ruling spirit or an egregore, takes possession of the public grid. The individuals within that crowd continue to feel like they are making independent choices, even as they march in perfect, unthinking lockstep toward their own destruction. This architecture of shared consciousness operates on a microscopic scale within our families and immediate lineages as well. Long before you learned how to articulate a single sentence, your nervous system was absorbing the unspoken rhythms, defenses, and psychological adaptations of your parents. Epigenetics now confirms that trauma can alter the expression of DNA across multiple generations, passing down a heightened sensitivity to stress or a persistent sense of unseen danger to offspring who have never experienced the original trauma themselves. But this inheritance is not merely chemical, it is informational. You carry within your internal monologue the unresolved arguments of your ancestors, the specific fears of your mother, and the quiet angers of your father. The voice you use to criticize yourself in the mirror is often just the voice of a critical parent or a distant teacher, echoing down the corridors of your history, masquerading as your own conscience. When we realize that our internal landscape is populated by the ghosts of others, the traditional concept of identity completely collapses. The ego, the tightly wound bundle of preferences, defenses, and narratives that we guard so fiercely, is revealed to be an artificial construct. It is a psychological artificial intelligence built entirely from the inputs of the external world, from the clothes you choose to wear, to the career path you pursue out of a hidden need for validation. The ego is a masterpiece of imitation. It is a costume woven from the expectations of a society that requires you to be predictable in order to function. You have spent your entire life polishing a mirror, entirely forgetting that the mirror possesses no face of its own. This realization brings us to a terrifying yet deeply liberating realization. If the ego is an artificial construct and the internal monologue is merely an echo of a collective mind, then the vast majority of what you suffer from does not actually belong to you. The guilt that keeps you awake at night, the unnameable anxiety about the future, the persistent feeling of inadequacy, these are not personal defects. They are the systemic properties of the network you are plugged into. They are the background radiation of a deeply fragmented human collective. You are not a broken machine. You are a perfectly functioning radio that has been tuned to a broken station for far too long. To break free from this loop, one must learn to recognize the subtle difference between the noise of the receiver and the vast, silent space in which the receiver exists. Every thought has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It arises, lingers for a moment, and then dissolves back into the void. But the awareness that notices the thought does not arise, and it does not dissolve. It remains constant, quiet, and completely untouched by the content of the transmission. The entire drama of human suffering occurs because we have mistakenly identified with the passing voices on the screen, rather than the permanent space of the theater itself. Yet, as we begin to step back from the noise and anchor ourselves in this deeper awareness, an even more profound mystery presents itself. If the mind is an antenna, and the collective human frequency is only one station on the dial. What happens when the antenna is tuned completely away from the human frequency altogether? What other voices, what older intelligences, and what forgotten architectures of knowledge are waiting in the silence just beyond the static of the world? To discover what awaits when the antenna is tuned away from the collective static, we must decipher the esoteric blueprints left behind by the mystics, alchemists, and heretics of antiquity. For millennia, these underground traditions maintained a dangerous secret: that the material world is enveloped by an invisible psychological net, an artificial layer of reality designed to intercept the human signal before it can reach the divine. The Gnostics referred to this cosmic architecture as the halos, a dense web of psychic manipulation overseen by entity constructs they called archons. These archons were not viewed as physical monsters with claws and horns, but rather as ideological and mental structures. They were the personifications of limitation, fear, and systemic conditioning. The Gnostics boldly asserted that these cosmic gatekeepers rule humanity by projecting thoughts directly into our minds, tricking us into executing their agendas while we blindly claim those thoughts as our own sovereign will. In this ancient view, the human skull is a contested territory, a crossroad where foreign forces compete for monopoly over your creative energy. When you look at the architecture of a medieval cathedral or an ancient temple, you are looking at a physical attempt to disrupt this psychic net. The precise sacred geometry, the soaring vaulted ceilings, and the intentional manipulation of acoustic resonance were not constructed merely to please the eye or intimidate the peasant class. They were sophisticated metaphysical instruments. They were built as shielding chambers, designed to quiet the chaotic frequency of the mundane world so that the initiate's internal antenna could clear its signal and receive the pristine, uncorrupted broadcast of the higher self. This brings us to a profound symbolic reinterpretation of one of the most misunderstood narratives in Western spiritual history: the fall of man. In the allegorical language of the book of Genesis, humanity's descent begins when they consume the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Notice that the tragedy is not the acquisition of wisdom, but the fracture of reality into dualistic judgment. To know good and evil is to divide the seamless, unified fabric of existence into binary categories: us versus them, right versus wrong, past versus future. This binary division is the birth of the linear mind. The moment humanity ate from that tree, their awareness dropped from the timeless, non-conceptual field of the present moment and fell into the prison of language, analysis, and perpetual inner debate. The serpent in the garden did not offer knowledge. It offered a ceaseless internal monologue. It introduced the second voice, the voice of doubt, shame, and separation, shattering the original state of pure, quiet observation. This psychological fracture created what the ancient Hermetic texts describe as a split house. When you are constantly talking to yourself, you are inherently divided into two entities: the one who talks and the one who listens. This internal duality is a massive energy leak. The sheer amount of life force required to maintain This perpetual inner warfare is staggering. It keeps the human nervous system locked in a chronic state of low-grade survival, burning through the light energy, or what the ancient Egyptians called sekhem, that would otherwise be used to activate higher dormant centers of perception. By keeping your mind trapped in a closed loop of rehearsing past grievances and planning future anxieties, the architecture of the matrix ensures that your energy is entirely consumed by the maintenance of your own prison. This systemic harvesting of human attention becomes visible when we examine the concept of the egregore, a non-physical entity or thought form that arises when a group of people share a common focal point, belief, or obsession. When thousands or millions of minds pour their emotional energy into a specific ideology, a nation-state, or even a modern digital brand, they are not just participating in a social trend. They are feeding an autonomous psychic organism. Once an egregore grows powerful enough, it reverses the flow of energy. It begins to sustain itself by feeding back into the minds of its hosts, dictating their thoughts, inflaming their passions, and demanding their absolute loyalty. The individual becomes a mere cell in a larger, invisible beast. When you feel a sudden, irrational surge of tribal hatred during a political debate, or a wave of manufactured panic while watching the evening news, you are experiencing the predatory pull of an egregore reaching down into your private antenna, twisting your dial to match its insatiable hunger. Yet, this dark architecture contains a fatal flaw. It is entirely dependent on your ignorance. A shadow can only project its image as long as you do not recognize the light source behind it. In the psychological alchemy of the East, this recognition is the ultimate threshold of liberation. The Tibetan Book of the Dead speaks of the terrifying, wrathful deities that the soul encounters in the intermediate state after physical death. The text explicitly warns the traveler, do not run from these monsters. Do not let them dominate your awareness. They are not real. They are only the terrifying projections of your own unexamined mind, taking form in the mirror of the void. The same rule applies to the living matrix of your daily life. The moment you look at a dark, intrusive, or anxious thought and say, "That is a thought, but it is not my thought," the spell is broken. You have introduced a gap between the transmission and the receiver. In that tiny, silent gap lies the entirety of human freedom. The voice may continue to whisper. The echo of the external mind may continue to reverberate through your nervous system, but it loses its authority. It can no longer compel you to act, because you are no longer mistaking the actor on the stage for the person sitting in the dark, watching the play. This leads us to a stunning realization about the true nature of what we call spiritual awakening. Awakening is not the acquisition of new, exotic information, nor is it the achievement of a higher, complex state of intellect. It is an act of radical subtraction. It is the absolute collapse of everything you thought you knew about yourself. It is the moment the radio realizes it is not the music, the news, or the static, but the copper, the plastic, and the space through which the electricity moves. But if you are not the voice, and you are not the story the voice has been telling, then what happens to your life when you finally choose to pull the plug on the broadcast, to step out of the theater of echoes and into the world of genuine action? We must look at how this unseen architecture plays out in our waking lives. The realization that our minds are porous receivers is not an invitation to passive fatalism. It is a call for a radical, militant hygiene of attention. Look around at the modern landscape. We are currently living through the most aggressive, synchronized assault on the human antenna in recorded history. The smartphones in our pockets, the targeted notifications flashing across our screens, and the predatory algorithms of social platforms are not merely conveniences or entertainment. They are precision-engineered tools designed to hijack your internal monologue. They do not wait for you to form an original intention. They inject a constant, high-velocity stream of noise directly into your subconscious, ensuring that your mind remains too cluttered, too reactive, and too exhausted to ever question the source of its thoughts. Every time you mindlessly open an app, you are allowing an external, corporate infrastructure to write the script for your next hour of mental life. The anxiety you feel about a crisis halfway across the globe, the sudden urge to buy a product you don't need, or the quiet envy you harbor toward a stranger's curated life. These are not organic human emotions. They are the calculated outputs of a machine designed to monetize your attention. When you allow these external inputs to dominate your field of awareness, you are effectively giving away the keys to your personal kingdom. You become a psychological puppet, acting out a series of pre-programmed behaviors while confidently telling yourself that you are walking your own path. Breaking free from this programming requires an intentional disruption of the network. It begins with the cultivation of what ancient contemplative traditions called vigilance at the gates of the mind. In practical terms, this means changing your relationship with your thoughts from one of identity to one of observation. When an intrusive wave of dread, anger, or inadequacy washes over your awareness, your habit is to instantly merge with it. You say, "I am anxious," or "I am angry." In doing so, you accept ownership of the transmission. To disrupt this loop, you must learn to change your vocabulary. You must shift from saying, "I am anxious," to observing, "There is a frequency of anxiety passing through the receiver." This subtle linguistic shift creates an immediate psychological buffer. It acknowledges the presence of the static without allowing it to define the nature of the radio. Furthermore, we must audit the environments and relationships that dictate our ambient frequency. Just as physical health is determined by the food we ingest, our mental architecture is shaped by the informational and emotional frequencies we consume. If you spend your time surrounded by people who are constantly locked in states of victimhood, judgment, or fear, your biological antenna will naturally tune into those exact channels. You will find yourself thinking their thoughts, adopting their biases, and experiencing their limitations. Protecting your consciousness requires a ruthless boundary setting. It demands that you treat your attention as the most sacred, finite resource in your possession, refusing to squander it on platforms, media, or dynamics that serve only to keep you small, reactive, and disconnected from your deeper self. This leads us to the re-emergence of an ancient, forgotten practice, the intentional cultivation of absolute stillness. The modern world treats silence as an empty void, a waste of productive time, or a terrifying vacuum that must be filled with noise at all costs. But silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of the receiver's distortion. When you sit in a room without input, without a book, a screen, a conversation, or a distraction, the inherited monologue will initially scream louder, desperate to regain its grip on your attention. It will throw worries, memories, and sudden impulses at you to force you back into a state of reaction. But if you maintain your seat and simply watch the storm rage without participating in it, a remarkable transformation begins to occur. The momentum of the external mind begins to run out of fuel. The static begins to clear. As the noise of the collective world fades into the background, the human nervous system naturally undergoes a profound recalibration. The chronic low-grade survival state that defines modern existence begins to quiet down. The heart rate slows, the breath deepens, and the brain waves shift from the chaotic beta frequencies of daily stress into the coherent alpha and theta states associated with deep creativity and non-local awareness. In this silent sanctuary, you are no longer a passive sponge soaking up the anxieties of the marketplace. You are resetting the dial of your entire being to its original, pristine factory setting. Yet, as the inherited voices fade and the vast, quiet space of your true nature opens up, you will discover that the silence is not empty. It is pregnant with a completely different kind of intelligence, one that does not speak in the frantic, linear sentences of human language. What is the nature of this quiet, wordless knowing that exists beneath the noise of the world? And what happens when it finally begins to guide your life? When you finally pull the plug on the collective broadcast, you discover that the silence left behind is not a void. It is a presence. For your entire life, the inherited monologue has convinced you that without its constant narration, you would cease to exist. It told you that you need its anxiety to stay safe, its criticism to improve, and its labels to have an identity. But as you sit in the quiet center of your own being, the grandest illusion of the architecture completely unravels. The voice falls silent, yet you are still here. You are present, alive, and completely aware. You realize that you were never the frantic, fragile character in the story. You are the immutable space in which the story unfolds. This brings us to the final, inevitable revelation of our journey, the true nature of knowing. The external mind that you inherited speaks exclusively in the language of thought, a linear, chaotic stream of words that constantly analyzes, judges, and divides. But the intelligence that dwells in the silence operates through a completely different mechanism. It does not think. It knows. It is the sudden flash of absolute clarity that hits you in a moment of crisis, the effortless intuition that guides your hands when you stop trying to control the outcome, and the deep, unshakable peace that passes all human understanding. Thought is electric, fragmented, and always searching. Knowing is magnetic, unified, and already home. You do not need to climb a mountain or study ancient texts to find the source of this wisdom, because it has never left you. It is the very foundation of your awareness, patiently waiting beneath the layers of noise you mistook for your life. This realization permanently shifts the way you walk through the material world. You no longer look at the chaos of society, the polarization of the digital grid, or the frantic demands of the marketplace with fear or anger. You see them for what they truly are: thousands of radios, all tuned to the exact same broken station, playing a song of limitation and survival. You no longer feel the need to argue with the broadcast or fix the static, because you are no longer plugged into the wall. You become an anomaly in the network, a person who can walk through a crowded room, look directly into the eyes of the collective hysteria, and remain completely unmoved, anchored in a quiet that the world did not give you and the world cannot take away. As you step away from this documentary and return to the flow of your daily life, the architecture will inevitably attempt to reclaim your signal. A notification will flash, a familiar worry will whisper in the dark, or an old habit will try to narrate your next move. But the script has been compromised. The next time a thought arises within your skull, do not automatically bow to it as your master. Do not rush to defend it, feed it, or call it your own. Stand perfectly still at the gates of your awareness. Look directly into the silent space of your mind and ask the only question that has ever mattered. If you are the one listening, who is the one speaking?